whispers of forgotten empires, echoes of lost gods, and truths buried in time. Welcome to Ancient Luminaries, where the ancient world comes alive.
A book doesn't survive 1,000 years by accident. It survives because it keeps finding people at the exact moment they need it most, when power feels slippery, when the world turns unfair, when the future looks like a door that won't open. And that's the strange thing about Boethius. He didn't write his masterpiece from a throne or a lecture hall. He wrote it when the state had already decided his story was over. Stripped of office, cut off from influence, waiting in a prison cell, he set out to answer the one question that makes every collapse feel personal. What can't be taken from you, even when everything else is? That question kept traveling quietly, stubbornly, until it reached the hands of people who had everything to lose. In the autumn of 1593, an older queen sat down at a writing desk in England and opened a book that had already outlived empires. Elizabeth I, politically seasoned, famously educated, and now past 60, turned to times the Consolation of Philosophy *, a work written nearly 1,000 years earlier by a Roman statesman in a prison cell. She translated the verse portions in a concentrated burst of work, a personal encounter between one ruler and a voice that had once spoken from the edge of death. That small scene matters because it proves something before we even meet the author. Boethius is not only a name in a textbook, he is a voice that keeps finding people who suddenly need him, rulers and prisoners, students and skeptics, believers and doubters. Anyone who has watched their world shift in a way that feels unfair. Now we step backward far beyond Elizabeth's England, into a world where Rome still exists as an idea, even after Rome has lost its old certainty. Anicius Manlius Severinus Boethius was born around the year 480 in Rome, into a distinguished senatorial family, the Anicii. The Western Empire had already fallen as an imperial institution, yet Roman culture still filled the air. Law, education, social ranking, the pride of office, the assumption that public service mattered. You could be Roman without a Roman emperor in Rome. You could still inherit a duty to maintain order, even while the ground beneath that order was shifting. Rome in Boethius's childhood was not the roaring imperial capital of earlier centuries, but it was still Rome in the imagination. Senators still walked among monuments that reminded them who they once were. Churches rose beside ancient civic buildings. Latin rhetoric was still taught as if the empire were permanent, even while local power was increasingly negotiated among kings, generals, bishops, and bureaucrats. It was a city where memory felt heavier than the present. That weight can shape a person in two opposite ways. It can make you cynical because you see the decline everywhere, or it can make you determined because you feel a duty to keep something alive. Boethius seems to have chosen the second path. He did not believe the past could be restored, but he believed the best parts of the past could be carried forward. That decision, made early, would define everything that followed. Boethius grew up with a double inheritance. On one side, he inherited the status of a noble household. On the other, he inherited a responsibility. Rome's aristocracy believed it existed to serve the public world. They were trained to govern, to manage administration, to settle disputes, to preserve continuity. In their self-image, they were the spine of civilization. Yet early in life, Boethius learned what a fragile spine feels like. His father died while Boethius was still young, and the boy was taken in and mentored by the powerful senator Symmachus. This was not merely charity, it was formation. Symmachus belonged to the highest layer of Roman society and carried a fierce devotion to Roman culture. Under Symmachus, Boethius received the kind of education late Roman elites treated as essential. Disciplined reading, careful writing, and the habit of argument, the ability to move between emotion and reason without letting either one take over the whole mind. One thing in particular made him unusual in the Latin West. He could work deeply with Greek learning. That mattered because the West was slowly losing easy access to the Greek intellectual world. When borders harden, travel becomes dangerous, and local crises consume attention, languages fade and libraries shrink. A civilization can forget its inheritance without noticing it is forgetting. Boethius saw the danger clearly. He did not want the Latin West to become a place where people remembered the names of Plato and Aristotle the way people remember ruins beautiful, famous, and unusable. So he set himself a task that now looks almost audacious: to translate and explain Greek philosophy and science for Latin readers. He translated, he wrote commentaries, he wrote treatises. He treated logic as an instrument of clarity, not as a sterile game, and he worked as if the survival of educated thought depended on making it teachable. What drove him was not only preservation, it was ambition in the best sense, the ambition to educate a future that he could barely imagine. Boethius publicly stated a grand plan. He wanted to translate all of Plato and Aristotle into Latin and supply explanatory commentaries, an entire philosophical library for the West then, if possible, to show how their greatest insights could be reconciled rather than treated as rival camps. It was a project that assumed time, peace, and institutional stability. He did not have those things, but he carried the plan anyway, like a torch carried through wind. In Boethius' mind, that plan was not academic vanity, it was a civilizational lifeline. If the West lost access to Greek thought, it would not merely lose ideas. It would lose methods, how to define terms, how to test arguments, how to reason from premises to conclusions, how to distinguish what sounds persuasive from what is actually true. Translating and commenting on philosophy was a way of keeping the West intellectually alive. He was trying to preserve not a pile of quotations, but a discipline of thinking. The tragedy is that history did not give him time. He did not finish that enormous plan, yet the unfinished bridge still reached far enough to matter. His logical works and commentaries became a central pipeline through which the medieval Latin world encountered Aristotle's logic. Long after his execution, students in monasteries and cathedral schools would wrestle with questions that come straight out of the kind of thinking Boethius taught. What is a genus? What is a species? How does language connect to reality? What do we mean when we say something is? Can words point to truth, or do they only trap us in endless disagreement? Those debates shaped minds for centuries. When people later called Boethius the last of the Romans, they were not only talking about his social rank, they were talking about his role as a transmitter. He carried pieces of the ancient world into a new age that desperately needed them, even if the new age did not yet know it needed them. Boethius also wrote about what later generations would call the quadrivium: arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. In his world, music did not only mean performance. It meant proportion and harmony, the way parts relate to a whole. It was a discipline that asked whether reality has a structure you can trust. If the universe has an order, then perhaps a human life can find an order too. If the world is not chaos, then grief might be survivable. Alongside logic and the mathematical arts, Boethius wrote theological treatises, bringing careful method into debates about Christian teaching. He did not see reason and faith as enemies. He saw reason as a tool that could help faith speak clearly and avoid confusion. For a mind like Boethius, truth was not divided into religious truth and philosophical truth. Truth was truth, and the human task was to reach for it with every honest tool available. This scholarly energy might make you picture him as a man hidden in libraries, distant from power. That would be the wrong picture. Boethius also rose in government. He entered the Roman Senate and moved upward quickly. He became consul in 510, a post that still carried deep prestige, even if the old imperial machinery behind it had changed. Later, he became Magister Officiorum, a senior administrative role close to the center of power. These were not ceremonial honors alone. They placed him inside the machinery of rule, dealing with communication, petitions, diplomacy, and the daily problems that determine whether a state feels stable or chaotic. There is a detail that makes his position vivid. Theodoric, the king Boethius served, wanted to project Roman sophistication to other rulers, and Boethius was drawn into scientific and technical tasks meant to impress foreign courts, projects that announced, in material form, that Roman skill still lived. Such an object is small, but it carries a message. The old Roman world still knows how to measure, build, and order time. To understand the danger inside that role, you have to understand the world he served. Italy in Boethius's day was ruled by Theodoric the Great, king of the Ostrogoths. Theodoric had taken control of Italy and presented himself as a restorer of stability after years of chaos. He maintained many Roman institutions and relied on Roman officials, which made his regime look, in some ways, like Rome continuing under new management. Yet beneath that appearance lay tension. Theodoric was not a Roman senator, he was a Gothic king. His legitimacy depended on balancing Roman elites, Gothic military power, and the shadow of the Eastern Empire in Constantinople. Theodoric's court, centered in Ravenna, was a place where language could be a weapon and silence could be a strategy. Gothic military men and Roman bureaucrats had to work side by side. Every appointment created envy. Every reform threatened someone's income. Every act of public virtue could be read as private ambition. In such a court, integrity is not always rewarded. Sometimes integrity simply makes you easier to target because your enemies know what you will not do. Boethius, by many accounts and by his own later complaints, did not settle for quiet compromise. He denounced corruption. That sounds admirable, and it may have been. Yet, in court politics, moral denunciation creates enemies. A man who exposes wrongdoing threatens those who profit from it. A man who insists on fairness becomes a problem for those who keep power through favoritism. Boethius's virtues could become a provocation. For a time, success seemed to protect him. He married Symmachus's daughter, Rusticiana, joining his guardian's family not only by gratitude but by blood. He had 2 sons, and like many aristocrats, he sought to set them on the path of public service. In 522, both sons were appointed consuls in extraordinary honor, so public that it was almost a celebration of the family itself. From the outside, it looked like a life that had reached the summit. It looked like a man who had achieved a rare balance, power and learning, public honor and private family, ambition and duty. But stability in that world could be a costume, and costumes can be torn. Underneath, the political weather was changing. Late antique Italy was not only balancing Romans and Goths, it was balancing the memory of an empire with the reality of a kingdom. Theodoric wanted stability, and for decades he achieved a version of it by presenting himself as a protector of Roman order. Yet stability does not mean trust. Stability can also mean that tensions are merely sleeping. One of those sleeping tensions was religious division. Theodoric followed Arian Christianity. Many Roman church leaders and senators followed Nicene Christianity. For long stretches, rulers tried to manage this division, and ordinary life went on. But religion could become political identity, and political identity could become a tool. It could be used to define insiders and outsiders, loyal people and suspicious people. It could turn theological difference into a language of accusation. The East-West relationship intensified the danger. Constantinople was not a distant myth. It was a living power with an emperor whose decisions could shift the political mood in Italy. In such an environment, a charge of writing to the emperor, whether true or exaggerated, could be framed as treason. The language of loyalty could be weaponized quickly. The fall comes in 523. At a meeting of the royal council in Verona, an official named Cyprianus accused a senator, Caecina Albinus, of treasonous correspondence with the Eastern Emperor Justin I. Boethius rose to defend Albinus and insisted the charge was false. In the heat of that defense, Boethius made a statement so bold it became famous. He declared that if Albinus had done this, then Boethius himself and the whole Senate had done it too. He was not confessing. He was trying to stop a purge by making the logic of the accusation impossible. The meaning was, if suspicion is enough to condemn one senator, then the Senate itself is already condemned. You are turning governance into terror. Boethius's instinct was to defend the Senate's dignity. He thought the old rules still mattered: evidence, procedure, a shared commitment to law. He believed, perhaps naively, that public life could still be governed by something more than fear. But once the machinery of accusation starts, it feeds itself. Evidence was produced against Boethius, whether real, manipulated, or mixed remains debated, and he was arrested. He was stripped of office, condemned, and imprisoned, held in Pavia. The speed of the fall is almost hard to grasp. 1 year you are a central administrator and public figure. The next you are behind walls, with the state rewriting your life in its ugliest vocabulary: traitor. There is a unique kind of pain in being punished by the system you served. It is not only the pain of losing comfort, it is the pain of losing meaning. Boethius had built his identity around service, learning, and public duty. Now duty is treated as deception. Loyalty is treated as conspiracy. His story is being rewritten by force, and he has little power to defend himself. Think of the personal side. A man like Boethius did not live alone. He lived in a web of family, patrons, clients, friends, and dependents. When he fell, the web felt the pull. His wife and sons would have faced fear and uncertainty. His father-in-law Symmachus, once his protector, would have been drawn into danger simply by association. Boethius's fall was not only a private tragedy, it was a warning to everyone watching the court. This is what can happen to a man at the top. The prison in Pavia becomes, in this context, more than a physical place. It becomes the symbol of how quickly the world can shrink. Your life goes from rooms filled with officials and petitions to a cell where the most important conversation is between your mind and your despair. That is why Times the Consolation of Philosophy, Times begins where it begins, not with a polished thesis, but with a man trying to keep himself intact. There is also the practical, almost tactile side of what he is doing. A prison book is written with limited materials, limited privacy, limited time, and a mind that cannot stop hearing the approach of the end. Yet the consolation is not a scribbled complaint. It is carefully shaped. It is arranged as a dialogue across 5 books, as if Boethius is building a path for his own mind to walk, one step at a time, from panic toward clarity. It is a disciplined response to chaos. Even its alternation of prose and poetry can be understood as a survival strategy. Prose carries reasoning. Verse carries emotion and memory. The mind argues. The heart sings. Boethius does not pretend he can think his way out of suffering without also feeling his way through it. He uses every tool he has, argument, poetry, metaphor, to keep the whole self from breaking. The consolation begins with Boethius as narrator, broken by what has happened. When reason feels distant, song arrives. Boethius portrays himself leaning on the poetic muses, as if lament itself is the only companion left. Yet he also sets a trap for himself. Sorrow can be comforting without being healing. You can become loyal to your grief, and grief will not tell you the truth. Then the book pivots. In Boethius's own telling, the very first scene is almost theatrical. He is sitting there, and the muses of poetry are with him, encouraging him to keep singing sorrow. They are not evil in the obvious sense. They feel tender. They feel loyal. They give him words when his life has turned into a nightmare. But philosophy does not treat them as neutral. She treats them as dangerous comfort because they feed emotion without feeding truth. She sweeps away the habit of lament the way a doctor might sweep away a harmful remedy, not because she hates the patient, but because she refuses to let the patient die clinging to what feels soothing. And when she appears with the kind of strangeness you only see in symbols that are meant to be remembered. Boethius describes her as somehow both young and old at the same time. Her eyes are bright and severe, like someone who has seen centuries of human self-deception and is not impressed by it. She is tall enough to touch the sky, and yet she can also shrink herself to stand in a cramped prison cell. That shifting size is not a fantasy detail for fun. It is a way of saying that philosophy reaches from the human mind to the highest questions, from daily pain to the structure of reality itself. A prison cell is small, but the mind inside it can still confront the whole universe, and philosophy is the guide for that confrontation. Her clothing is also a map. Boethius imagines letters woven into her robe, often understood as signposts of a ladder levels of knowledge, the climb from the practical to the contemplative, from what we do to what we ultimately are. But that robe is torn, pieces are missing. Rough hands have grabbed at wisdom and taken fragments. Again, the image is not accidental. It reflects Boethius's time. Learning is under pressure, cultures are colliding, and intellectual traditions are being broken into pieces. Philosophy arrives not to admire the damage, but to repair what can still be repaired. Then she starts with questions that sound simple, but are not. Do you know who you are? Not your name, not your family, not your former titles. Who are you underneath fortune's gifts? What is a human being if offices can be stripped away overnight? What is left if the world calls you traitor and the state writes a new story over your life? Those questions do something important. They pull Boethius away from the court's narrative and back toward his own mind. They remind him that his true identity does not depend on a king's favor or on public applause. This is one reason Christian readers later found Boethius so usable. Even though the book does not quote scripture the way many devotional texts do, its first move is not to preach. Its first move is to recenter the soul on something larger than the day's verdict. And that is why, even here, the book already feels like more than philosophy in the classroom. It feels like emergency medicine. Boethius is at the bottom of his life. Philosophy refuses to let him stay there. She does not deny that injustice has happened, She does not pretend the court is fair. She does not say everything is fine. Instead, she says something harder. If you want to survive, you must stop measuring reality by what fortune lends you, and you must begin measuring reality by what cannot be stolen. Only after she has established that foundation does she begin to take him toward the bigger landscape. What happiness truly is, why evil seems to prosper, how providence and freedom can both be real, and why God, so far above our grasp, can still be close enough to guide the mind that is falling apart. And that is where the next part of the story begins.
Tonight's story comes to an end here, but the past never truly goes silent. It lingers like a candle's last glow, whispering its warnings, its wonders, and its unanswered questions into the present. If this journey moved you, leave a like, subscribe to Ancient Luminaries, and tell me in the comments